Throughout history, the line between revolutionaries, oppressors, and saviors has always been thin. So, which side is Megatron on? Was he a ruthless dictator or a leader fighting for his people? In the Transformers universe, the Autobots are often portrayed as the heroes and the Decepticons as the enemy. But is everything really so black and white? Perhaps Megatron was a freedom fighter who rebelled against the wheels of the system. Let's dive deeper into this question and find out if Megatron was really right. Before we begin, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Megatron was not only an enemy leader, but also a symbol of revolution. In the Transformers universe, his name is often associated with fear and destruction. But there is a point that can be missed at first glance. Megatron started out as just a working-class Cybertronian. Like many revolutionaries, he saw the pain and suffering of his own people and believed that something had to change. The class discrimination on Cybertron, the gap between the wealth of the upper classes and the poverty of the lower classes, ignited the rebellion within Megatron. This set him on a path that took him from a once oppressed and wronged individual to a ruthless leader. However, Megatron's story was not limited to personal anger. He was, in fact, the voice of a people. The government on Cybertron was authoritarian and rigid. Resources were distributed unevenly, and the poorer classes were virtually ignored. Megatron decided to start an uprising against this injustice. At first, his movement looked like a kind of workers' revolt. But at the time, was it a justifiable rebellion for someone who wanted to change society to take the lead? Megatron's ideals were initially quite clear: a strong government, a more just society. However, this journey took a different turn after a certain point. His goals became more destructive over time, and his initial vision of change led to more and more suffering and destruction. This transformation showed just how determined and dangerous a figure Megatron really is. But there is a question to be asked. If the rulers of a society do not treat its people fairly, then don't the people have the right to shape their own future? Did Megatron turn into a dictator who lost his ideals, or was he just a leader who exposed the brutal face of the system? In a way, we can decide this question by looking at his actions. But the whole story of Megatron has depths that suggest that at some point, everyone can be right. Megatron's movement was not just a rebellion, it was the manifestation of a worldview. To understand his war, it may not be enough to look only at his actions. From his point of view, there was a logic at the beginning of everything. There is a system that oppresses the people and protects only the powerful. So, in the face of such blatant inequality, is Megatron's rebellion justified? The emergence of the Decepticons actually raises a deeper philosophical question. If the rulers of a society ignore the needs of the people, then how justified is it for the people to seek leadership, rebel, and establish a new order? Megatron has started a kind of class struggle on Cybertron. The wealth and privilege of the upper classes and the poverty of the lower classes was, in his eyes, an intolerable injustice. Initially, his goals were much more idealistic: equal rights, a just system, and better living conditions for all segments of society. But over time, Megatron's socialist vision became increasingly dark and ruthless. How did a leader who claimed to be fighting for the rights of one people end up destroying almost the entire planet? A leader's goals may be right, but the methods he uses are a different question altogether. Megatron said he was defending his people, but the price of that defense was too high: destruction, war, death. In this case, no matter how right his ideals may be, can his methods be justified? Another important point is the concept of power. Megatron was a leader who believed that power was the solution to everything. His philosophy was not just a dictatorial order, but a philosophy based on the notion of survival of the fittest. This approach unfortunately led him to choose to use his people for his own ends rather than serve them. Finding the balance between power and justice was Megatron's biggest mistake. So, in this case, was Megatron right? His initial ideals may have been necessary for a powerful change, but the path he took to realize them cost the lives of many innocent people. In discussing Megatron's vindication, we must also consider the difference between his actions and his ideals. Can the righteousness of a leader's cause justify his methods? The fact that Megatron's war became so bloody and destructive may show how he actually lost a just rebellion. But despite its destruction, his call remains important. If a society is not just, then change is inevitable. When questioning whether Megatron is right, we must also consider the Autobots, who are often seen as the enemy he faces. The Autobots are often portrayed as a symbol of goodness, honesty, and order, while the Decepticons, on the contrary, are associated with chaos, destruction, and selfishness. However, questioning whether everything is as it seems can help us move beyond these simple oppositions. Optimus Prime, the leader of the Autobots, is a figure who has always stood for justice, freedom, and equality. But what approach should be taken to defend these values? Optimus Prime's and the other Autobots' battles can sometimes be tough and rigid in the name of defending their values. The good and righteousness they stand for may not always be in everyone's best interests. The Autobots, who advocate the preservation of the existing order on Cybertron, fiercely resist the Decepticons who want to change the way the system works. This creates a structure that reinforces a binary worldview. How clear is the line between good and evil? When we examine Megatron's point of view, his rebellion in defense of the rights of his people is not just a cruel rebellion. His actions are an effort to change the system. But is this effort evil? Or is it something that must be done to create a livable world? Autobots often defend the rightness of their order and ideals without question. However, to simply categorize this into good and bad is to ignore a much deeper truth. What the Autobots know to be true may be the foundation of the new order that the Decepticons want to establish. But Megatron's practices often lead down a much more brutal and destructive path. But can the righteousness of a rebellion justify its course? While Megatron's devotion to the Decepticons is synonymous with utter ruthlessness, it may be worth reassessing for a moment his purpose: to change the existing order. Many times, the sides we identify as good may in fact be the ones that prevent the struggle of the sides we see as bad, suppress them, and wield unbridled power. All these questions reveal a more complex reality that lies beneath the surface of binary oppositions. The line between good and evil is in fact often blurred. At this point, debating whether Megatron's cause is justified does not simply result in one side triumphing. Seeing the case through the eyes of both sides can also make us question the way we look at concepts like justice and equality. While recognizing the righteousness of the Autobots, perhaps we should also consider the Decepticons' resistance against social inequalities. Megatron's character is more than just a cartoon hero or a villain. His story makes us question many revolutionary movements in the real world, their understanding of leadership, and how power should be used. Megatron is actually a representative of many similar figures historically. Like many rebel leaders in world history, he rose up against the oppression of a system and wanted to liberate his people. However, his struggle reveals what a leader who wants to shape the future of society can sacrifice for this cause. When we look at history, we see that every revolutionary movement has had different outcomes. In the beginning, a revolution usually starts with demands for equality and freedom. However, as leaders gain power, they can deviate from their ideals and often become cruel. This is where Megatron reflects the darker aspects of human nature. When he reaches the pinnacle of power, he finds it difficult to maintain his idealistic thoughts, and instead begins to control and restrain his people more and more. This is a turning point that also shows his destructive side. Megatron's lust for power does not only make him a hero who liberates his people. The more power oppresses people, the more destructive it is. The more it becomes a question of whether a leader is right or wrong. The question of how power should be used is a question that has persisted from time immemorial to the present day. Is a leader's power to be used for his people, or only for personal gain? Megatron is a figure who is stuck exactly on this borderline. His idealistic goals and warrior outlook for society are often at odds with his own inner weaknesses. Power becomes a tool of force rather than an instrument of justice. We see similar stories of revolutions and leadership in the real world. Many leaders emerge on a path to liberate their people, but over time this process evolves into another goal: to hold on to power and fight it. The tragedy of Megatron is not just that he destroyed a planet. The real tragedy lies in how easily revolutionary ideas can be corrupted. While he wants to save his own people, he comes to a point where everything can be sacrificed for this cause. Megatron's story reminds us how careful a true leader must be. A leader's responsibility towards his people is a determining factor in how he uses power. He must face not only his responsibility to his own people, but also the responsibilities of power and leadership. Megatron is lost in the fulfillment of this responsibility, unable to see when and how his righteousness has been corrupted. Ultimately, what Megatron's war seeks to question is not just Cybertron, but the entire world. Power, leadership, and revolution, though they always start with good intentions, can be distorted and corrupted by the darker sides of man. Megatron's story is an example of how easily the purity at the starting point of any revolution can become intertwined with darkness. This is a lesson that applies to many similar figures in history. Idealism, when combined with power, can always become an uncontrollable force.